You're ready? Okay. Welcome to Bellingham Voices. I'm Marie Marchand. My guest today is Dr. Sandra Alfers. Dr. Alfers is the founder and director of the Ray Wolpow Institute for the study of the Holocaust, genocide, and crimes against humanity. She is also a professor of German at Western Washington University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you for inviting me.
It's so nice to have you here, and I've been looking forward to our conversation today.
Me too.
The first time I became aware of you and your work was in March of 2015 when you were part of a Dean's Lecture Series at City Hall. And the featured speaker was Dr. John Roth. He spoke on the ethics during and after the Holocaust.
Right.
How did you first meet John Roth, and what was his role in the formation of the Institute?
I first met Dr. Roth at a seminar, Professional Workshop Development, at Northwestern University. The Holocaust Educational Foundation hosts a summer institute, and I had the great fortune of attending that as a student, even though I was already a professor, and he taught one of the courses. And so this is how I met him, and then I learned that he had retired in Washington State. He's a professor emeritus from Claremont McKenna College. So once I knew that, we stayed in touch and invited him, as you pointed out, to Western Washington University, where he was really essential in helping getting the Institute going. So, and we've been in touch ever since, and he's been back to Bellingham, and I hope he'll be back soon.
I wanted to point out to viewers that the video is actually on our City of Bellingham website. It's the YouTube, so they can go see it there. Now, who is Ray Wolpow? Tell us a little bit about him, because the center is named after him.
So Ray Wolpow is a retired professor of secondary education at Western Washington University, and for a number of years he was the director of the Northwest Center for Holocaust, Genocide, and Ethnocide Education. And he was essential in bringing Noemi Ban, our local Holocaust survivor and educator, to campus on a number of occasions. And when Ray retired, of course, that left a big vacuum at the university. So this is when the university decided to move forward with expanding the groundwork that Ray had laid by creating the Institute.
How has your German heritage played a role and influenced you towards your life's focus, it seems, or your career focus on the Holocaust?
It's a very interesting question. I think for me, growing up in Germany and being German, like for so many of us, it's a part of our history, and it's so much part of the fabric of our identity that there really it's just something that you deal with. So for me, I came to it through literature. When I was in a PhD program at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where I took a class on the culture of memory, and I had always been interested in poetry, and in this class for the first time I explored the topic of poetry written in the concentration camps. And this is really where I changed my focus on that particular research area, onto that research area. I was working in 19th century German literature before. I was looking at German Romantic women writers, also as poetry, but that's, I think, how it is so often in college, even in PhD programs. You take a class with a professor that's really inspiring and a topic that is just strikes you at a really good moment in time for your own personal development. And so that was a long time ago, and I've been sticking with that topic for a long time.
Are you a poet yourself?
I'm not. I'm not, definitely not.
Tell us about Elsa Dormitzer.
Yes, so Elsa Dormitzer was a German-Jewish writer, activist, and journalist. And she wrote poetry in the Theresienstadt ghetto and transit camp. And when I was writing my dissertation, I first discovered her poetry. So later on, when I returned to the writing of the Theresienstadt ghetto, this is when I wanted to find out more about the author of these 10 poems that I had in front of me. And so I set out to try to find surviving relatives, and I succeeded, and they were kind enough to open their family archive to me, and I was able to put together her amazing story, which is not really known in Germany, even in her hometown, and many aspects of her life also weren't known to her family. So we discovered that she was a prolific children's book author and had written more than 25 children's books. So, so really through the poetry, I was able to put the pieces of a puzzle almost together of her life and learn more about her. She was really quite extraordinary, and her life is just an amazing story.
Most people think of poetry as an individual act because the poet writes by him or herself alone. But you have talked about the collective experience of poetry in the camps. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that? I'm really interested in that.
It's a very good question. I think in order to start answering that question, let's think about the camp system for a moment that was developed between 1933 and 1945. And it's important to remember that not all camps were the same. They were developed over long periods of time. They served different functions and purposes at different times. And the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum estimates that there existed more than 40,000 of these camps. So it's really important to keep in mind the particularities of the different camp sites that we talk about when we talk about camp writing. But at the same time, as you say, it was a collective experience in the sense that we have evidence of writing taking place in a number of campsites. And poetry being a form that prisoners gravitated to for a number of reasons. We can really look at that poetry as a transnational body of text that has been written in many different languages and many different countries.
That's remarkable. That figure is tragic, yes. And not many people know that. I didn't know there were that many. I mean, we think of Auschwitz and Treblinka and Sobibor, and people know those names, and Dachau.
Right.
But there are so many more.
Yes, there are many, many more, and I think it's really important to keep in mind the different functions that these sites had at different times throughout the time frame that we're talking about, 33 to 45. But yes, the sheer number is I think, good to recall, too, because sometimes we tend to focus on just a few of these sites.
And in terms of poetry, you said something when we talked a few weeks ago that I found really curious, and like a lot of the content we talked about, it's disturbing. And but this was just really curious to me. I'm a poet, and there's things that I value about poetry.
Right.
And two of them are that it's a self-exploration, and it's a self-healing. For me, it facilitates a self-healing. And the second one, second aspect I value most is that it can be a tool of education and transformation for other people who are hearing it and reading it. So what you had told me is that after the Holocaust, there were some Jewish scholars who actually told survivors not to write poetry. So what do you think was the rationale with that?
Well, I think not so much Jewish scholars, but really German scholars. So this was really in the context of post-war West Germany. So the idea was that there was this challenge of knowing how to read these kind of texts. So it was not so much about that these texts had been written by, as you point out, survivors, but also those who did not survive, right? Because a lot of times these are the only traces that might remain of a human being is through their poetry. So German academia had a hard time knowing how to fit this into the traditional aesthetic evaluation of poetry, because people wondered about what are the consequences if I say this is a good poem. Does this mean that something good came out of the Holocaust when I see it within that framework? At the same time, can I say this is a bad poem, perhaps knowing that this is really the last trace that we have of that human being? So it was more about finding new categories of aesthetic judgment of the poetry that German academia struggled with for a really long time. So, And I have to say, this is definitely an issue that arose in West Germany after the wars. Germany was trying to come to terms with the Nazi past and really saw this rupture in the continuum of German history that, for a lot of literary scholars, also required new kinds of writing, and poetry being more fragmented, more abstract. And as you point out, this soothing factor of poetry in the camps really being something that provided balance and comfort and support in times of utter chaos. The very traditional, particularly in the German language poetry from Theresienstadt, it's really this traditional set of German language poetry where you have rhyme that's really important and almost children-like rhythms and structures and language, not for all of them, but for many of them. So there is definitely a different purpose that the poetry served that German academics had a hard time for various reasons, and some of them are definitely also political, wrapping their minds around.
Was poetry a sort of rebellion for people? Or how would you say, you said people gravitated towards it in the camps. What did it do for them, and what do you think they thought about when they wrote poetry, or why did they write it?
Right.
I know you can't fully know, but I'm just curious what you're thinking on that.
I can talk a little bit about the Theresienstadt ghetto and transit camp that I worked on, and some of the biographies or autobiographies and diaries and testimonials that I've read. And so there it really was an opportunity to give testimony, to really attest to what was going on around the prisoners, to make sense of the chaos, again, to find comfort and support. There is a wonderful autobiography by a Holocaust survivor and also literary scholar Ruth Krueger, who published a book called Still Alive, A Holocaust Girlhood Remembered. And she talks about how important it was for her that poetry just really also helped her to pass time. So it kept her sanity at moments of absolute chaos and insanity around her, because she could just focus in on that. Because if you think about it, pen and paper were not readily available. So a lot of the writing and reciting poetry happened in the mind, and really gave people, I think, something to hold on to. Another Holocaust survivor, Gerti Spies, who also wrote in Theresienstadt, she, in one of her books, writes about poetry, the poems held me, I held them, we held each other. So it's, again, providing this comfort and support. There were poetry competitions, for example, in Theresienstadt that were organized by prisoners. And they shared these texts also with each other. So there are just a range, I think, of purposes why people gravitated towards writing poetry. It's a long answer to the question, but it's a really good question.
And it's important, the content that you're saying, and it makes me think that maybe sometimes when society thinks about people that were in the camps, that it was such a dehumanizing environment that we maybe forget about the humanizing nature of something like poetry, right? That people were able to keep their own essence, their own commitment to existence and their own sense of self, and even to the point of pursuing art in poetry.
Well, and it reminded them that they were autonomous human beings, that they were not a number. And I think you're absolutely right. This is where it really is survival and finding an art form to help with that.
I remember Elie Wiesel wrote about the power of imagination and how that was so many people's savior during that time.
Right. It was an escape from reality as well. If you, again, Ruth Krueger points this out in Gerti Spies, if times were particularly tough, if you could just drift away to another world or just focus so much on creating a poem that would rhyme and give structure in your head, it would really give them also a feeling of just humanity, just being able to do that and to sort of resist. I mean, I think this is also something that I haven't mentioned before, but art as a form of resistance. I think this is what we know of the poetry, this is what we know of the music from Theresienstadt as well, and a spiritual resistance against the dehumanization that was taking place and annihilation.
So talk about the diversity within Holocaust studies, because you're a literary historian and there's people that study different aspects of the Holocaust. So how broad of a field or discipline is it?
It's a very diverse and very interdisciplinary field. So Holocaust studies really comprises historians, literary scholars, musicologists, and all work on different aspects of the Holocaust. So I think that the field has really evolved to be being much more transdisciplinary than perhaps it was a number of years ago, when it was more historically based and grounded, which of course it still is, and there's still important research being done on this, but the field has also opened up tremendously to other disciplines, and this is also where, my work comes in. I was trained as a literary scholar, not as a historian, but of course I can't distinguish or divide or separate these two from each other. That just wouldn't work. But I just read the texts a little bit differently than I would if I was a historian looking for something else or having another motivation.
We've been focusing on the Holocaust in our conversation, and your institute also analyzes different genocides. My question is the big question, and it's probably a question you get a lot, and it's, how do genocides happen? There's a quote from Mother Teresa that says, "We have no peace because we have forgotten that we belong to one another." And I'm wondering your thoughts on how do we get to a point where we forget we belong to each other and start murdering our neighbors?
It's such a difficult question to answer. How do genocides happen? I think the sobering answer is that mass violence can happen at any time in places where civil liberties and freedoms are under attack. That's important to remember. There are warning signs for genocide, right? So, for example, changes in governance structures or social fragmentation. What has happened more and more is that we can move towards recognizing warning signs of genocide. Because you're absolutely right, the Holocaust is not the last example of genocide. We've had this ongoing, just to name Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, Cambodia. We have ethnic cleansing going on in Myanmar as we speak. So the question is really, how can we stop, I think, and prevent genocides from happening in the future? And I'm very hopeful for the scholarship that is being done, and that's really also hands-on in working with government organizations and recognizing warning signs and being able to act. I'm hopeful, however, that these warning signs can be recognized and that we move towards quicker action if we can see that genocides are about to occur, or that mass violence is happening, that things can be done about it. And I think the final thought is also, we talk about it as a global event or global events, right? But I think it's important for us in Bellingham, in the Pacific Northwest, in Washington State, to also think about our local histories and how we can work on dealing with past genocidal incidents and acts, and work towards reconciliation and making sure that things like that never happen again.
And an example of that is the Arch of Healing and Reconciliation that's being built on the library lawn, and it's in recognition of, in the past when Bellingham has been treating people bad, and in particular the Sikhs in the early 1900s.
Yes, absolutely. That's very important.
How does the history of the Holocaust speak to us today?
I think it speaks to us through Holocaust education, because if we think about it, the Holocaust was not an accident. It was made, or it was a choice by individuals, by organizations, by governments to legalize discrimination and for hatred, prejudice, and mass violence to occur. So I think the Holocaust, and I focus on the Holocaust in my own research, as we've explained, so this is why I go back to that, is that it gives us good pathways to connect to other traumatic events that have happened and that are ongoing. So the Holocaust education is really doing a marvelous job across the United States, connecting to different communities, organizations, and building bridges and really engaging in community building. So what I can think of, for example, in our own state, the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle does amazing outreach work. We have another university, PLU, that has a Holocaust and Genocide Studies minor. They have an educational conference. We work with the schools. Washington State has a mandate a recommendation to teach the Holocaust in schools. And of course, all of these lessons are brought into the relevance of 2017 and how we can apply these lessons. So I think, the Holocaust speaks to us through this education, and at Western it speaks to us really through the courage of Noemi Bond, who was the first to break her silence in Bellingham and to speak about the traumatic events that she went through. So I think this gives us a task to continue her work and her legacy, particularly in Bellingham.
Thank you. You have an event coming up.
Yes.
Very important speaker, so talk about that.
So on November 15th, on a Wednesday evening at 7:30, we will welcome historian Deborah Lipstadt to campus. This event is free and open to the public. Tickets are required, but they're available from the Western Washington University box office. And as I mentioned before, she's a historian, and she's going to talk about Holocaust denial. The Pickford last year screened the film Denial that featured Rachel Weisz playing Deborah Lipstadt. And the film was about the lawsuit that was brought against her by a Holocaust denier and anti-Semite, David Irving. So she's going to talk about this at Western, and we are very excited that she'll be coming to Bellingham to visit campus.
I just wanted to share a little story. When I was a student at Seattle Central Community College in 1998, I took a class called Voices of the Holocaust with Dr. Lori Cohen.
Okay.
And it was 4 days a week, and it was for the whole quarter. And it was, as you can imagine, just very impactful to focus on that. We not only read a lot of autobiographies by survivors, but we got to meet some. And one of those people was Thomas Blatt. And he was a survivor from Sobibor concentration camp and was involved in that revolt. And so our class drove down to Tacoma and listened to one of his talks. And on the way out of the auditorium back into the lobby, there were these two young people waving flyers and pointing at him and saying, "You're a liar. The Holocaust never happened. There were no gas chambers." And so the professor and the students, he was starting to yell, and they were turning around Mr. Blatt and, shepherding him into another room. Yeah. And so I went forward to the girl who was younger than I was, and she was waving in my face, and I told her, how can you do this? I mean, this man suffered more than we could ever imagine, and you're wrong, you're lying, and I can't remember what happened after that, but those few moments are just indelible in my mind that people could even think that.
Yeah, it's unfathomable that there are actually people out there who say that the Holocaust never happened after all the evidence that we have. So I think it's important that Deborah is speaking about this very pertinent topic at Western in November. And I encourage all of your viewers to come and get a ticket and be there. So Marie, let me know if you're coming to campus.
I will
that would
definitely
be great to welcome you and the community there. So
thank you. I will be there.
Good.
So to close our time together,
Yeah.
I'm curious what brought you to Bellingham. I mean,
okay.
so from Germany, I'm sure you had a circuitous route to get here, but what brought you here and what keeps you in Bellingham?
So I completed my graduate education in the United States. And when I was done with my PhD, I was applying for jobs. And then in 2008, I was lucky enough to be offered a position at Western Washington University, where I joined the faculty of the German program in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages. And I've been here ever since. And this is my home. I love Bellingham. I'm from northern Germany originally, which is very flat. So you would think that after all of these years, I would have gotten used to mountains and hills and so forth. So I'm still struggling with that, but I find the landscape and the town and the people just to be absolutely stunningly beautiful. So we joke in Germany that I live there where other people go on vacation. So I'm very happy and very lucky to call Bellingham my home.
Well, thank you, Sandra, for your time today. And thank you for all the work you do for Holocaust education and your life's work, bringing this awareness to people around the world. It's very meaningful, so thank you.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you for reaching out and for being an advocate of our work. Really appreciate it.
And thanks for joining us on Bellingham Voices. We'll see you next time, and take care.